Every morning, a poor girl sold flowers at the gate of the palace. Behind those golden gates lived a prince who had everything. Then one morning, a quiet stranger stopped at her stall and bought a single flower. He came back the next day, and the next. She never knew she was smiling at the prince himself, but a prince must marry a queen. And what is a flower girl to a crown? In the kingdom of Umwama, where the great red walls of the palace rose against the morning sky, there lived a girl named Adais. Everyone called her Ada. She was 18 years old, with hands that smelled always of jasmine and crushed green stems, and a smile that came easily, even when her life gave her little reason to smile. Each morning, long before the sun had warmed the dust of the market road, Ada was already awake. She would gather flowers from the riverbank and the hedges along the village paths, white jasmine, red hibiscus, soft yellow blossoms, whose name no one remembered, and her fingers would weave them into garlands while the world still slept. By the time the gate of the palace opened for the day, she was there, kneeling on her woven mat at the very edge of the great square, her garlands laid out like a fallen rainbow before her. She did not have much. A single mat, a basket, a few coins tied in a corner of her wrapper, but she had her flowers, and she had her smile, and she gave them both freely. The palace gate of Umwama was the busiest place in the kingdom. Traders shouted, "Donkeys braid!" The smell of roasting maize drifted on the air, and the cool shadow of the great red walls fell across the square each morning. Ada loved it. She loved the noise and the dust and the faces, and though many walked past her without a glance, she greeted each one the same. "Good morning. May your day be sweet." That was Ada, and that was the morning everything began to change. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? To understand this story, you must understand the two worlds it lived in. For in Umwama, there were two worlds, and they touched only at the palace gate. The first world was Ada's. She lived in a small mud-walled house at the poor end of the village, where the roof led in the rain and the floor was swept earth. She lived there with her grandmother, old Mama Nkechi, whose eyes had grown cloudy and whose chest rattled when the cold came, and with her little brother Chidi, a boy of 7 with a gap in his teeth and a laugh that filled the whole house. Their parents had died when Chidi was still a baby, and from that day, Ada had carried the family on her own young shoulders. She rose in the dark. She wove her garlands. She walked the long road to the palace gate and sold them flower by flower, coin by coin. And when the day was done, she walked the long road home again with bread and a little fish for the pot. She never complained. When Mama Nkechi coughed in the night, Ada warmed water and sat beside her until the coughing eased. When Chidi cried because the other children mocked his torn clothes, Ada held him and told him that a torn wrapper covers a whole heart. She was poor, but she carried her poverty the way a queen carries a crown, with her head high and her hands open. That was the first world. The second world lived behind the great red walls. Inside the palace of Umwama, everything was gold. Gold on the pillars, gold on the cups, gold thread in the cloth that hung from the high ceilings. The old king, Esudo, ruled there, a powerful man with a heavy face and a heavier crown, and beside him, in the days of this story, lived his only son. The prince's name was Namdi. He was a young man of perhaps 22, tall and quiet, with a kind of stillness that comes to people who have never once been alone. From the day he was born, Namdi had been surrounded, servants to dress him, tutors to teach him, nobles to flatter him, guards to follow 3 steps behind him wherever he walked. He had everything a man could want, and want for nothing, and yet his heart was as empty as the great gold hall in which he sat each evening, listening to the silence beneath the noise. For this was the wound that Namdi carried. Hidden under all that gold, it was lonely. Not the loneliness of a man with no people around him, but the deeper loneliness of a man surrounded by people who do not see him. The nobles bowed to his crown. The maidens smiled at his title. No one, in all his life, had ever once looked at Namdi and simply seen a man. They love the prince, he told himself in the quiet of the night. They have never even met me. And so the prince had begun to do a dangerous thing. When the court grew too cold and the flattery too loud, he would wrap himself in the plain brown cloak of a common trader, slip past a side door that only he knew, and walk out into the city, not as the prince, but as no one at all. Just a young man in a worn cloak, breathing the dust and the noise, free for one stolen hour to be ordinary. The guards did not know. The king did not know. It was Namdi's only secret and his only freedom. And it was on one such morning, with his face half hidden and his heart half asleep, that the Prince of Umwoma walked through the great gate into the busy square, and saw, for the first time, a poor girl selling flowers, and smiling as though the whole hard world were a gift. He did not know it yet, but the empty hall in his heart had just heard the first note of a song. The prince almost walked past her. That is the truth of it. He had walked past 100 flower sellers and beggars and traders, his eyes down, his thoughts far away. But something made him stop. Perhaps it was the color of the garlands, bright as a sunrise against the gray dust. Perhaps it was her voice, soft and unbothered, saying to a passing stranger, "Good morning. May your day be sweet." Namdi stopped. He looked, and the girl looked up at him and smiled. It was not the smile the nobles gave him. It was not the smile of a maiden who knew his rank. She did not know his rank. To her, he was only a young man in a plain brown cloak. And she smiled at him the way she smiled at everyone, freely, warmly, as if his being there had made her morning a little brighter. "Good morning," she said. "Would you like a flower?" For a moment, the prince did not know how to answer. He had been spoken to by ambassadors and warlords, and the daughters of great chiefs, and none of it had ever made him feel the way this simple question made him feel. He cleared his throat. "How much for one?" he asked. "For you." Ada tilted her head, considering him with mock seriousness. "One small coin. But the smile is free." And the Prince of Umwoma, who had not laughed in longer than he could remember, laughed. He bought a single garland of white jasmine. He did not need it. He had no one to give it to, but he laid his coin on her mat and lifted the flowers, and the scent of them filled his head like cool water, and he found that he did not want to leave. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ada," she said. "And yours?" He had not planned to lie, but the truth was a heavy, golden thing, and he was so tired of carrying it. "Nudu," he said. It was a name 1,000 men shared. "I trade in cloth with my father." "Then welcome, NDU." "The cloth trader's son," said Ada, and she smiled again. "Come back whenever your road brings you here. The flowers are always fresh." He came back the next day. Every morning, the prince wrapped himself in his plain brown cloak, slipped through the side door, and crossed the square to the flower seller's mat. Every morning he laid down his small coin and lifted a single garland. And every morning he stayed a little longer than the morning before, to talk, to listen, to watch the dust turn gold in the rising sun, and to see her smile. They spoke of everything and nothing. She told him of her grandmother's cough, and her brother's laugh, and the river where the best jasmine grew. He told her carefully as much as he could of a father who was hard to please, and a life that felt like a cage of gold. He did not say it was a palace. He let her think it was a merchant's house, and a merchant's father, and a merchant's heavy expectations. And it was not entirely a lie. The cage was real. What he could not say, even to himself, was this: that for one stolen hour each morning, beside a poor girl in a basket of flowers, the loneliest man in the kingdom did not feel lonely at all. But who was the quiet stranger in the brown cloak, really? And how long can a prince hide his crown behind a smile? The mornings became the best part of the prince's life, and the most dangerous, for the more Namdi came to know Ada, the less he wished to be a prince at all. He learned that she gave away more flowers than she sold. A blind beggar at the corner received a garland every Friday and never paid a coin, because, Ada said, he cannot see the colors, but he can smell the spring, and everyone deserves a little spring. He learned that she had not eaten breakfast on many of the mornings she greeted him so brightly, because the bread had gone to Chidi and the medicine to her grandmother. He learned that she sang while she wove old songs her mother had taught her, and that her voice was soft and true and unaware of its own beauty. And one morning, when a cruel trader knocked over her mat and scattered her flowers in the dust and laughed, Namdi watched Ada kneel calmly, gather every bruised blossom, and say only, "It is no matter. Flowers do not stop being beautiful because someone threw them down." And the prince, who could have had that traitor flogged with a single word, said nothing, because to speak that word would be to lose forever the only place on earth where he was simply Nudu. He began to bring her things. Not gold. Gold would have frightened her, or worse, changed her. But small things, a warmer shawl, left over from my father's stall, a little pot of honey for her grandmother's cough, a wooden top for Chidi, who shrieked with joy and called the stranger brother Nudu. Each gift he gave as though it were nothing, and each one Ada received with a grace that humbled him. And somewhere in those small mornings the Prince of Humwoma gave away the one thing he had always guarded his heart. One evening, as the sky turned to amber and the square began to empty, they sat together on her mat, among the last of the flowers, and Ada said quietly, "You are not like the other traders." Nudu, his heart went still. "No, no," she said. "You speak like a man who has never had to count his coins, and you look at the palace sometimes as though it has hurt you." She smiled, but her eyes were searching. "Whoever you are kind. That is the only thing I have ever needed to know about a person." And in that moment, with the ambalaith on her face and the truth burning in his throat, the prince almost told her everything. This was the false dawn, the moment when it seemed that love might simply, quietly win. But it was not to be so easy. For that very night, the great hall of the palace was lit with 1,000 lamps, and the old king Izuro summoned his son before the throne. "You are a man now." The king sighed, his voice rolling like thunder through the gold hall. "And a kingdom cannot rest on one life alone. The time has come. Namdi, you will choose a wife, a queen." The prince's heart turned to stone. "Father, I have already begun." The king went on, lifting his hand. "I have sent word to every noble house in the land. In 30 days, the daughters of the great families will gather here, in this hall, and from among them you will choose the most beautiful, the most highborn, a woman worthy of a crown." And he gestured, and into the lamplight stepped a tall, proud, dazzling young woman in cloth of deep blue and gold, her chin lifted, her eyes cool and certain. "Lady Azine, daughter of the kingdom's richest chief." "Lady Azine honors us by being the first to arrive," said the king, well pleased. "Is she not a fitting queen?" Azine smiled at the prince, a smile that knew its own worth, that had never once been refused. "Your Highness," she said, and inclined her head as one inclines to a thing one already owns. And Namdi, looking at her beauty and her pride, thought only of a poor girl in the dust who gave her flowers to a blind man and felt the gold walls closing around him like a fist. The days that followed were the hardest the prince had ever known. By night, he sat through endless talk of dowries and bloodlines and crowns. By day he fled to the gate, to the only place he could breathe, but now there was a shadow over the mornings, for he knew that a clock was ticking, and that the secret he had kept so gently could no longer be kept at all. And it was Ada who learned it first. Not from his lips, but from the cruel mouth of the world. It happened on a market morning. A herald in royal cloth strode into the square, beating a small drum, and cried out the king's proclamation for all to hear, that in 20 days the daughters of the great houses would come to the palace, and that Prince Namdi, and here the herald gestured grandly at the great red gate, would choose his queen. The square buzzed, and a woman beside Ada's mat, craning to see, laughed and said, "Ah, the prince. They say he is young and tall and walks the city in disguise. The foolish boy, as though anyone could hide a crown." Ada's hands went still upon her flowers. "A young man, tall, quiet, who walked the city in disguise, who looked at the palace as though it had hurt him, who had never once had to count his coins. Nudu. The flowers slipped from her fingers. That evening, when the prince came to her in his brown cloak with a smile and a small carved comb he had brought for her hair, he found Ada standing very still, her flowers unsold, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You are the prince?" she said softly. It was not a question. Namdi's heart broke at the look on her face. "Ada, you are the prince," she said again, and now the tears fell. "And in 20 days you will choose a queen from among the great houses of the land. And I am a flower girl from the poor end of the village who let herself forget, for a few foolish mornings, that the dust and the gold do not mix." She pressed the little comb back into his hands, gently, the way she did everything. "Thank you for the honey and the shawl and the top for Chidi. But you must not come here any more. Nudu, it will only hurt us both." And she gathered her mat, and her basket, and her unsold flowers, and walked away into the falling dark, leaving the Prince of Umhoma standing alone in the empty square, holding a comb meant for hair he might never touch, more alone than all the gold in the palace had ever made him. The day of the choosing came. The great hall of Umhoma blazed with the light of 1,000 lamps. Down its length stood the daughters of every noble house in the land, gowned in silk and gold and beadwork, their hair dressed high, their jewels throwing fire against the walls. At their head stood Lady Azine, radiant and certain, already half a queen in her own eyes, and upon the high throne sat old King Azudo, his heavy face proud, waiting for his son to walk the line and lift one of these glittering women into history. The drums sounded, the doors opened, and Prince Namdi entered the hall. He wore the robes of his rank now, deep crimson and gold, the prince's circlet upon his brow. The nobles bowed low, the maidens smiled their practiced smiles, and the prince walked slowly down the long red carpet, past one beautiful face and then another, past silken jewels and proud lifted chins, and his own face was as still and grey as stone. "My son," called the king, well pleased, "choose. Lady Azine stands ready. Will you not take her hand?" Azine stepped forward, her smile certain, her hand extended like a gift no one had ever refused. And the prince stopped. He looked at the line of glittering women. He looked at his father upon the throne. He looked at all the gold and the fire and the waiting kingdom, and then, in the heavy silence of that great hall, he spoke. "Father," he said, and his voice carried to every corner, "you have gathered for me the most beautiful women in the land, the highest born, and every one of them smiles at me." He paused, "but not one of them has ever seen me." A murmur ran through the hall. The king's face darkened. "Namdi, they bow to my crown," the prince went on. "Stronger now, they smile at my title. They would love the prince and never know the man." He turned and looked down the long line of dazzling faces, and not one of them understood. "I have walked this city as a stranger. Father, I have stood in the dust with no crown on my head and no gold in my hands, and in all the kingdom only one person ever looked at me and simply saw a man worth being kind to. Only one. A poor girl who sells flowers at our own gate, who gives her last bread to a blind beggar, who gathered her flowers from the dust without a single bitter word, and who smiled at me when I was no one at all." The hall had gone utterly silent. Lady Azine's extended hand trembled, and slowly fell. "You would shame me." The keen sigh, rising from his throne, his voice like thunder. "For a flower seller, a girl with no name, no house, no gold. She cannot be a queen." And the Prince of Umhoma lifted his head and answered his father with the words that would be remembered in Umhoma for 100 years. "A crown does not make a queen. Father," he said quietly, "a heart does, and I have never in my life met a heart more fit to wear one." If this love story is touching your heart, subscribe now. The ending will stay with you. For a long moment, no one breathed. The old king stood upon the steps of his throne, his face a storm, staring at the son who had defied him before the whole gathered nobility of the land. And the prince stood his ground, unmoving, unafraid, his eyes steady. It was the king who looked away first, for Izudo was a hard man, but he was not a blind one. And in the silence of that hall he remembered, suddenly, a thing he had buried long ago, the face of his own wife, the prince's mother, who had also once been a girl of no great house, whom he had loved before crowns and politics had hardened him. He remembered being seen. He remembered being loved as a man and not a king. And he looked at his son and saw not defiance, but the same fire that had once burned in his own young heart. "Bring her," the king said at last, his voice rough. "Bring me this flower girl. Let me look upon the heart my son would set above a crown." And messengers were sent running through the city, to the poor end of the village, to a small mud-walled house with a leaking roof, to bring Ada to the palace. Ada came to the palace in her plain wrapper, with the dust of the road still on her feet. She had not dressed for it. There had been no time, and she had no fine clothes to dress in. She walked the long red carpet of the great gold hall in the same simple cloth she wore to sell her flowers, past the glittering noblewomen and the staring lords, her heart pounding, her head, as always, held high. She did not know why she had been summoned. She only knew that she would not be ashamed of who she was. And at the end of the hall, upon the high throne, the old king watched her come. He watched the way she walked, without fear, without pride, with a quiet dignity that no jewels could buy. He watched her pass, Lady Azine, who drew back her silken skirts, as though poverty were a stain. And he watched Ada simply inclined her head to the great lady with a gentle, unbothered grace. And when she stood at last before the throne, the king leaned forward and studied the poor girl his son had defied a kingdom for. "They tell me," said the king slowly, "that you did not know my son was a prince." "No, your majesty," said Ada softly. "I knew him only as Nudu, who bought a flower every morning, and was kind to a blind man, and laughed when I told him the smile was free. And now that you know he is the Prince of Omwoma, what do you want from him?" The hall held its breath. It was the question every grasping heart in that room would have answered with gold, with titles, with crowns. Ada was silent a moment. Then she sighed, simply, "Nothing, your majesty. I did not love him for his crown, because I did not know he had won. I loved the man who was kind, and her eyes were clear. If he is a prince, then he is a prince. It changes nothing in my heart, but it changes everything in my life. And I am only a flower girl. I want nothing from him but to know that the kindness was real." And the old king, Izudo, who had ruled a kingdom and commanded armies, and never once been moved by the words of the great, felt his hard heart break open before the honesty of a poor girl in a dusty wrapper. He rose from his throne. He came down the steps. And before the whole gathered court of Omwoma, the king of the land took the flower girl's two work-worn hands in his own. "My son told me," the king sighed, and his voice was thick, "that a crown does not make a queen, that a heart does." He looked at her for a long, long moment. I did not believe him. I believe him now. He turned to the silent, watching hall, and he lifted his voice, so that every soul within it would hear. "Hear me, people of Omwoma. This is no flower girl. This is the woman my son has chosen, and the woman I now choose for him. Let her be raised. Let her be honored. Let her be crowned. For she has shown this proud court a thing that all our gold had made us forget, that the richest soul in this kingdom was kneeling all this, whiling the dust at our very gate." And he placed Ada's hand into the hand of his son. Namdi looked at Ada, and Ada looked at the man she had known as Nudu, and across all the distance of gold and dust between them, they were simply, once again, two people who had seen each other clearly. "You knew the smile was free," he whispered. "And the flower was only one coin," she whispered back, through her tears, and she laughed, and he laughed. And the whole hall, even Lady Azing, even the proud lords, found themselves moved beyond their pride. So it was that a poor girl who sold flowers at the palace gate was lifted in a single evening, into the heart of the kingdom. And in the days that followed there was a wedding such as Umhoma had never seen, with the whole city in the streets, and drums that beat from dawn to dawn, and flowers everywhere, white jasmine and red hibiscus and soft yellow blossoms whose name no one remembered, strewn down every road the new bride walked. For the people had heard the story, and the people had taken it into their hearts. The flower girl had become their queen. A year passed in the kingdom of Umhoma, and if you had walked through the palace gate in that year, the same great red gate where a poor girl had once knelt on a woven mat, you would have found it changed. For just inside the walls, where the dust had always blown, there now grew a garden. Queen Adais had planted it with her own hands, jasmine and hibiscus, and 100 bright blossoms. And every morning the poor of the city were welcome to come and take a flower, freely, for nothing, exactly as she once had given them. Old Mama Nkechi no longer coughed in a leaking house. She sat in the warm sun of the palace courtyard, the finest physicians at her side, telling long stories to anyone who would listen about the granddaughter who had carried them all. And little Chiti ran laughing down the gold halls in fine clothes, with the gap still in his teeth, and called the prince, as he always had, Brother Nudu, and the prince only laughed and led him. Lady Izine, in time, married a good lord of a distant province, and when she came to court she found that the queen bore her no grudge at all, but greeted her with the same gentle grace she had shown her in the hall. And the proud lady learned at last that there are kinder ways to be great than she had ever known. And the old king Izudo, lived to see his hard heart soften entirely, and he would sit in his daughter-in-law's flower garden in the evenings, and say to any who would hear, "I almost chose gold. My son chose a heart." He was the wiser king before he ever wore the crown. As for Namdi and Ida, they ruled long, and they ruled well, and they were never again lonely, neither of them, for each had found the one thing that all the gold of Umhoma could never buy, a person who saw them clearly and loved what they saw. And so the children of Umhoma still tell this story, beneath the great trees when the evening comes, and they end it always the same way, with the words the old king himself first spoke in the Gold Hall on the night that a flower girl became a queen. A crown does not make a queen. A heart does. Thank you for joining us for this story. Subscribe and click the bell so you never miss a story. Watch our next story here.